moment of inspiration. Oh, I got way louder there. That moment of inspiration is a really good indicator. So, my suggestion is when you're going through the process, and I know I've got a lot of the students here from Purdue that have talked about this before, but when you're going through that process, I always suggest, literally just sit around and have a good old-fashioned brainstorm with your friends, and talk about it, and let that brainstorm sort of just go into, oh my God, we could do this. Holy crap, wouldn't that be cool? Most of those ideas will never see the light of the day in your final competition because they're going to always need to be simplified and cleaned up, but it's a really good indicator if you've got a good concept. Number 2 is a really important one for me. It's reducing the barriers for entry. We'll talk about misconceptions and like how to deal with them later on in this hour, but the bottom line is that one of the most powerful parts of a contest, like a CTF contest, is it has the power to engage people who you might not otherwise get a chance to talk to. And so that's why construction is really important when it comes to actually taking the concept and bringing it down to the level of challenges and the things that are the mechanics of it. But as one of the things that I keep in mind, and that the people that I work with, I always try to keep in mind with them, is that you've got to realize that the experiences that are in your brain are not the experiences that are in everybody else's brain. And we all learn in different ways. Some people are auditory, some people are visual, some people are tactile. And so really trying, there's a couple of strategies that I use to not just make all the challenges in one of those fields, but also to make sure that there is a good difficulty ramp up, right? You're always going to, a good CTF that has that engagement factor is always going to have opening challenges that are going to be, very straightforward and simple so that people can get used to the mechanics of, playing with a server, playing with a challenge, and then submitting a flag. So I always try to make sure that we reduce as many barriers to entry as possible. And then, obviously, the larger goal here is to induce lateral thinking. One of the sort of ways that, so I run a team of researchers. One of the ways that I like to interview, and it's one of the techniques that I use in the way I build challenges, is, I present a situation, and then I start taking away your tool set, right? You got the Metasploit to find all the vulnerabilities in the server. Well, okay, what are you going to do if you don't have Metasploit? Oh, you're going to disassemble that binary with IDA Pro. Well, what if you don't have $4,000 to pay for that every year, right? And, okay, what if they're blocking port 445 as an exfil? What am I going to do next, right? So, one of the things that I think is a pattern in the way that we do our day jobs, or some of us, some of the things when we're maybe not doing it as a day job, but doing it, for fun, is that really, we're kind of like that Neo in the Matrix sort of philosophy, right? Where you're dodging the bullets as they come, or you're working around them, right? It wasn't that, he could stop the bullets right until the end. For a while, he was just really good at dodging them, and that's sort of a little bit of a metaphor for the, the way that I like to talk about lateral thinking, is that start pulling away those elements that you're used to and that you're comfortable with, break those assumptions, and, that's where you really become a creative attacker and a creative defender, because you can, A, move somewhere and somebody's not expecting, and B, anticipate those sort of things when you're on the other side. And then, obviously, I wouldn't be me without putting this one on here, but you got to make it fun. I mean, the idea is that, some of these contests that people run are really serious. Through my, I play a lot of CTFs myself, and I can tell you the number one way to get me to just be like, I don't care, is when you see people that are not having fun around you. And, that attitude I've found really reflects the way that you run one of these things. The more whimsy, the more comedy that you can build into this, so it's not just monotonous, like, here's a server IP, do a thing, where you actually build a little bit of that story into it. This is the thing that keeps people coming back. So, at a high level, those are the goals. And keeping on with the Super Troopers theme, these are some of the common misconceptions. And so I'm going to speak about this part in sort of the apologetics way, right? So these are things that I hear every time I run a competition, and I'm going to tell you, if I was talking seriously to them, what I would say in response. And this is something that can speak to the motivations of the people that are, the patrons of your CTF, because that's really the way that I treat them. I'm not a CTF person. This is one of my favorite ones to talk to because, I'm not all those CTF people, the ones that are sitting in the corner that are, they're from Des Moines or anyone else, but, I had to shout that out at least once, but there's a wide range of the amount of effort that people spend with CTFs. That's just the nature of human nature. And the bottom line is, I always set a goal, and I always suggest that people set a goal, is just learn one thing. If you add one skill set to your toolbox in every conference or at every competition you play, holy crap, if you play, for a year, you've added significant value to what you can do. And so, this is a resetting of goals and expectations things. Guess what? Usually only 3 or 4 people get prizes out of one of these things. If you are in this to win a drone or an Amazon gift card or whatever, you're not really doing it for the right reasons in terms of the end of the day. So, I'm not a CTF person, wrong. Everybody's a CTF person because nobody is telling you you've got to solve everything and do everything every time. CTFs don't teach you about the real world. Wrong. That's just wrong. Is it going to be the same as enumerating a server in production and not taking it down? Is it going to be the same as, going through miles and miles of syslogs to find that one problem of that malware that's been sitting on that guy that clicks everything's workstation? Okay, yes, the practical implications of the CTF challenges are not the real world. I'll grant you that. But the skill set and getting familiarity with the tools and the, like I was talking about earlier, that creative drive, that's exactly the quintessential employee that everybody, at least that I'd like on my team to have, because I know that I can set you loose into a situation and, you can function in a way that I don't have to, work from a script, right? This is the thing, this is the compliance principle that a lot of people in InfoSec talk about when you have that list of checkboxes, right? Everybody loves GDPR and PCI and PSD2 and all this stuff. But when you reduce those things to checkboxes, that's how breaches happen. That's how things fall through their cracks. Working CTFs, learning how to, be creative in these situations, that is exactly the thing that the real world needs. So, in as much as maybe it doesn't teach you about the real world, okay, fine. It teaches you better than the real world because it tells you to be creative along the way. So, to the people that say this, I say, wrong. If I'm not going to win, it's not worth trying. You know what? If that's the reason that you're in this industry, just for the money and just for the prizes and stuff, you know what? Just, go somewhere else because I don't have time for that ideal. The whole point of this hacker community, the whole point of this, this InfoSec, community that, at least for me, is actually to do as much with as little as possible. Because, speaking from, a managerial perspective that has, budgetary approval, I can tell you that practically, the first thing that gets cut from every budget in the world is security. Because it's the last line item on the budget, it's the longest tail in terms of schedule, it's the highest risk. If, what if we find something 2 days before we go live, right? Practically, it's the safest thing to cut from an executive perspective. And so as professionals and hobbyists, it's sort of endemic on us to figure out the most we can do with the least amount of resources and time and make ourselves most effective as we can. And so, if I'm not going to win, it's not worth trying. That's like, well, if people are going to make it through my firewall, I might as well not have one. That doesn't make sense, right? You've got to do something. And so, to the people who say that, I'd like to give them a hearty wrong. as well. And I'm sorry for all of those of you that I triggered with the pictures in my So that's sort of the motivational side of it. Let's talk about, some of my examples and, war stories about defining a good challenge. Because I think this, talking to people that have developed CTFs, and I've helped mentor a few groups that as they go down this path. Some of the problematic parts that frustrate people are the things I'm going to highlight in this section. First and foremost, this is the number one pet peeve that I have, and the number one pet peeve that everybody I've talked to that's been angry about a challenge that I've written, because I've written a whole bunch of challenges that made people angry, and legitimately so. That's the first time I tell you, sometimes, especially when I've done this a long time ago, I used to write things that I had absolutely no concept for what logically followed one to another, or it was something that I had seen thousands of times because of my familiarity with the technology or familiarity with doing this before in some context. And the thing that I left out were the signposts. If A doesn't follow to B and B doesn't follow to C, even if those connections are tongue-in-cheek or they're always more obvious in retrospect, right? My style of cluing, for those of you, that are playing this, you notice that I use a lot of verbal irony in the way that I clue things, a lot of double entendre, a lot of homophones of words. So I tend more towards the English side, and I actually learned a really important lesson about this when I was engaging with a CTF that I ran overseas, is that, guess what? That doesn't work when it's not in English. And this is one of the things that I actually learned. I'm talking about a couple months ago, and I've been writing these contests for years. And I never even thought about the fact that, homophones in German don't make sense. You just tack things onto the end of the words, but that's a different story altogether. The idea here is that, as you go along, one of the things that I suggest doing to make sure that the signposts are essential, find yourself a friend that's a playtester. That's the best thing I can tell you. That's always why I tend to run CTFs in teams now. When I write a challenge, I have Mike Connor try it out. When he writes a challenge, more or less, when I have time, I make sure that I give it a try. But that cross communication, that check of somebody on the inside, is invaluable in making sure that that all of your challenges, follow along. Everybody with me on that one? Making sure. So, because you want the number one way to make somebody angry. Just throw some, random thing up there with nowhere to go with it, and they'll just sit there and stare at it for the time of the CTF, and then be like, what was I supposed to do with this? And they're like, oh, you didn't realize that it was this cipher with this key that you've never heard of anywhere? That stuff doesn't fly, and you need to make sure that you double check yourself, because speaking from experience, it's very easy to get yourself lost as you're going around the narrative. The other thing that I do here is I've gotten into the habit, this is a software development principle. You got to make yourself comments along the way, and I'll talk about the methodology, but I always put a README file in every directory of the source code repository that I use to contain all of my challenges. And the reason is that if you're going to do 60 or 50 or 40 challenges in a CTF, and people are going to be asking questions about them randomly over time as you unlock things, in crazy order, and people are going to have different contexts, you will have to have, signposts for yourself, or else you're going to get absolutely lost. And as probably some of you have probably even experienced during this, if you catch me when I'm outside of that room, not in front of my computer, and you ask me, what does this modulus mean in this piece of source code? I'm going to look at you like, I wrote that 4 months ago, and I don't remember what I had for lunch yesterday, so I need to go and look. So leaving those signposts for yourself is also really important. Clear criteria for success. This is like the number 2 way to frustrate CTF players. And so there's a couple of ways that we can combat this. This is always, a balance between making sure that the flags are not obvious and stick out so that you can usually grep through something and find it immediately, right? That's too easy. On the other side, it can be difficult to find flags when it's especially really deep in something like a PCAP, for example. I'll tell you this, is that that's one of the major motivations that I use for using a flag format that has the prefix and the brackets around it. That is, for me, this is the way that definitively, if you followed all the directions, I know there's a couple of exceptions in this year's CTF, but more or less, if you follow all the directions, you come up with something that has that format, you have a reasonable certainty that that's the correct flag. And that's really the thing that I try to build into all of these challenges. And so being explicit about that on the rules, reminding players when they're having problems to think about the flag format, all of those things can help somebody have a clear criteria for success. And that's pretty straightforward once you embrace that. And I'll talk more about my methodology later. But I write all of the challenges that have what I'll call complicated generation in Python. And the reason that I do that is that you sometimes need to go back and change things and alter things. And the bottom line is that it's a lot easier to change a line in the source code file and rerun the program than it is to go and grab your hex editor and try to work backwards from there. And so building yourself the ability to change this over time is a really valuable thing. So this is a strategy that I've tried to embrace over time. I don't hit this mark every single time, very admittedly so, but I always try to have elegance and simplicity with my challenges, where I really aim at boiling down a challenge to one nugget of information or one trick or one thing that's a deviation from the norm. Because I find that sometimes you get lost when there is a multiple, weird command line options for a tool or arcane binary formats or, one of those things. If you're stacking those on top of each other in a challenge, you're probably creating something that A, is too hard for the room, and B, is likely not going to give somebody the ability to learn an individual thing with a challenge. I tend towards, exposing idiosyncrasies in the services and software that we use, things that no user in their normal right mind would ever come across, how to redirects on an HTTP server work, how do I programmatically interact with something that's on a netcat? I mean, those things are all interesting pieces where there's one skill set that you can then build things on. Excuse me. With the netcat example, which is totally one of my favorite challenge types, I can tell you that practically in my real world, I've used that same script to interact programmatically with SMTP servers, because it's the same underlying TCP packaging technology, and sometimes you want to do shenanigans to try to enumerate things really quickly, and scanning devices are sometimes really heavyweight, and if you want to do it to, the entire internet at once, you're going to have something that's really fast and really light and really targeted. And, having the familiarity with dealing with synchronization and, all of the different protocols, they're the building blocks of when you're trying to do crazy researchy sort of things that, perfect tools don't exist for yet. This is a good way to have that toolkit. I put everything like that in GitHub gists, whatever, where later on I can, look in my own account and say, oh man, I wrote a script for that later, and I pull that back. I couldn't tell you how many times that I pulled things that I've written from CTFs to actually use in the real world. But the whole point is that when you simplify these things, you give the people playing the CTF the best chance of having that toolbox and developing for themselves. Because it's not everybody's native idea to write yourself a set of scripts that you can use over time. And that's one of the things that I think we don't train as well from the academic level these days. Even the degrees that are focused specifically on cybersecurity, one of the things that I'm pushing as part of this is actually the idea of building yourself a digital toolkit and making some things that are simple tools, because the challenge of simplicity can sometimes help people, move towards that ideal. All right, let's talk a little tech. So I'm going to tell you basically the more or less the infrastructure that I'm using to run the CTF. It's a fairly repeatable thing that I do for all of them. So you take it or leave it. This is the way that I do it, but I'm exposing to you why I'm doing it the way I'm doing it and for what reasons. There are times you don't want to do it like this that are completely legitimate. So I want to make it very clear, this is not, I'm saying you have to do it like this everywhere. There's only one way to do it. This is the way I do it and why. So I use the Google CTF framework in terms of the actual back-end software. It's written in Python. It uses Flask for the API management. It uses Angular for the page layouting, and it uses Markdown for rendering the individual challenges and pages. Heavily customized is the meanest thing that I could put in the slide deck that I'll share outside of this. But what it means is I have heavily fixed a lot of the things. For the people that understand web development, and the fact that you might use your mobile phone to access the CTF scoreboard, especially when there's challenges that are not computer-based. The original version of the stock version that's on GitHub right now has a column on the CSS that's 99,999 pixels long, hard-coded. And so last year, 2 years ago, I never even knew that, I'd never even opened it on my mobile phone, the porthole that I'd put on. And when I opened on the mobile phone, I tried to get to the content. I'm scrolling. I'm scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and literally it ended up being like the equivalent of 3 miles down my screen. I fixed the user-facing side of that. That's a lesson that I've learned, is that I'm going to try it on a host of different mobile devices, just at least as a smoke test, to make sure that, again, reducing the barriers to entry, we want to make sure that that happens. I also had to pretty significantly change the database schema in the back end, which was, I'm not a database programmer, but I became one over the last few months, to change it so that this style of CTF worked. This is actually the first time I've run a CTF where you can have multiple solves for people on a team. You would not believe how many things that breaks in terms of the constraint of a database. Where you assume that everybody's trying to work towards the same goal. But we got there. I had some friends that, again, helped me out with testing. I'm like, hey, submit this flag. And then, we get, 500 errors all over the place. And I'm like, okay, found it, and we go back to the corner case. I'm, shocked. I don't have any wood to... Well, I've got some wood I'm sitting on, but I've got no wood I'm knocking on that I haven't gotten any since the thing started. So you're at least respecting the part of the rules that says don't attack the scoreboard, and I heartily appreciate it. The link here to the scoreboard is the one I use. I'm going to push a couple of fixes that are, I think, not specific to this con back to my personal fork of that. It's just /Lintile. So if you ever want to take a look at that, you're obviously more than welcome to. I will say that this framework is Jeopardy-style CTF only. So, you could probably use it for other things, but this framework has that Jeopardy board and the categories for the challenges built in, and so it becomes pretty quick to do that. All of the pages are in Markdown, so really you can add arbitrary paths to the server fairly easily. And then you've got static directories that you can serve up static content as well that you basically just drag and drop into the web server. In terms of the way that I run it on the front end, it's all Python based, so I use UWSGI to serve the socket up, and then I use Nginx to do all of the front end web, the web protocol stuff, and Let's Encrypt for the SSL certificate, and we do all of the stuff through the scoreboard on SSL. Actually, I'm going to pause here in the middle for questions, because I know I just ran through a ton of technologies. Did anybody have any questions about that? Like what aspect of it I did a certain way? Okay. If you think of it later, ask me again. So this is a philosophical choice that you have to make when you're running a CTF. Do you want it local or do you want it in the cloud? I always prefer in the cloud for a couple of reasons. Number one, I don't have to lug shit. And pardon my French, but look at my brokenness. I don't want to have to bring a server rack to every conference I go to. Number two, it's cheap. I mean, I can tell you, all told, with all of the services and servers, I got a couple of extra large and a load balancer and all kinds of stuff in front of this. I think my total bill is going to be like $30 for the entire con, and I'll leave it up for a month. So, in terms of return on investment, you could probably, for smaller things, even get away with free tier stuff. I use the bigger ones because, we were expecting, we had 580 people that bought tickets thereabouts for this con this year. And I always expect about 50% to at least log in and interact with the CTF. So that's how I kind of base my user numbers on experience from years past. So I bumped up a level on things this year, but we're right in the green zone in terms of usage. But yeah, I use AWS. I have friends that do it on Azure. I have friends that do it on DigitalOcean. The one thing that I'll mention is that the security groups are really important to lock down. The one thing I'll suggest is that even if you're trying to do it on the cheap, separate all of the challenges that you do for web and like the netcats and all of those things that are network-based from the scoreboard server themselves. It's not practically because of like web attacks or anything like that on the server. I mean, that probably, if there are different hosts, that probably prevents misconfigured things from doing poor, making things bad. The reason I do it is because I'm using technologies that are similar on both sides, and it's very easy to kill a bunch of containers and then accidentally take down your scoreboard server. So segregating it, even though it's maintaining more servers on the cloud side, is the thing that I do. And then previewing the next slide, Docker. I containerize everything early and often. Hit the button, rebuild, push it. I've gone through a couple of generations here with AWS and Docker. I used the Elastic Container Service before, but it wasn't a very good model for the frequency that I push updates. Because frankly, over the con, I'm even adding challenges and modifying the server. So I actually just run a stock Ubuntu machine that's up to date with Docker running on it through AWS. That way I can interact directly with the machine because it's a little bit different of a reason and a rationale than when you're doing this like in an enterprise or in a data center, right, where you want to have to not log into the machine and do things. The point is that in this, logging into the machine and be able to kill individual containers or uprev individual containers means that I don't have to do a lot of infrastructure work around there to create this. So on the challenges site, for example, I've got 7 different containers running with different things on there. So the other thing that's an interesting thing to talk about in CTF world is things are going to go wrong. You have to embrace that when you're running a CTF. It's inevitable. Murphy's Law and programming things, usually without sleep, usually a few hours because, usually a few hours before the con starts because, we all have things that we do during the week that, take our time. They're inevitable, but they're manageable. So I'm going to talk about it from a couple of different ways. Let's talk about questions. I look around at certain faces in the room, and I know that there are people that love to pump for information, and I'm all about that. I think that's a big part of playing these games is, getting information from people running it, other teams, etc. I want to talk a little bit about my thoughts on balancing evading questions and handing the answers to people. The best way to get an answer out of me that has actionable information is to, in your question or in the thing you're telling me, show me your thought process and show me that you've engaged with the problem. If you show me the code you're writing, if you show me the commands you've tried to run, if you've showed me the, the tools that you've tried and not worked. My philosophy on teaching, I am way more likely to point you further in the right direction because I see that you're actually engaging. If you talk to me and say, how do I get this flag? You're going to get the Rick Astley level, Rickroll, trolley answer, because the thing I'm trying to instill even in the people that do that is that, listen, if you don't put in the due diligence, if you don't do the reconnaissance, if you don't do the work, just like in our day jobs, you're not going to have a good outcome in the end, and your report's going to be 3 findings that are just copied from the Nessus report, and that's not worth anything. That's the easiest way to get good information out of me, is to show me, show me what you got. To quote, I haven't had a Rick and Morty quote, so show me what you got, and that's that's my philosophy there. I screw up. I screw up often. I screw up all the time. Sometimes I put flags in the scoreboard wrong. Sometimes I misconfigure services. Sometimes I kill Docker containers that I shouldn't and make them go down. Sometimes I just completely boof a challenge. Hi, Meat Shield. Thanks, buddy. I appreciate that. That's good. I hope you got that on the tape. That's awesome. I'm going to use that later. But the bottom line is, don't worry about it. Fix it, admit it. If it's really bad, buy the person that was frustrated by it for a couple hours of beer and move on. Fostering that trust relationship between you and the people that are playing your CTF is actually a really important part of it that's difficult to do. And then over time, it will actually increase the amount of communication that the player does, because that way it's a positive interaction with the person running it, so that they're not just going to sit there stuck, so that in the end you're going to have better retention for the people that are playing it, and you're going to have more fun in the end because you don't waste time on stuff that's meaningless. Fix it, admit it, be straightforward about what's going on as much as you can, and move on. That's the best strategy. Actually, for a long time, I was actually a football official, like an actual on-the-field football official. I know that some of you probably have a hard time visualizing that because you've never been to DEF CON, but that's neither here nor there. But the thing I'll tell you is that this is a strategy that I pulled from officiating. Coaches get angry when you miss a call. They like to scream in your face. But the one thing that shuts them up because they have no response to, sorry, coach, I missed that one. I'm going to get the next one. They can be still angry, but now they're not angry about anything in specific, and so there's nowhere to go with that. It's a really cool way to using conflict management, and this goes way beyond CTFs. This is what I do in my life. When I screw up, I tell people, straightforward about it. We move on. That's called credibility. That's the way we should all work, in my opinion. Last, backups. It actually happened to us. Backups. You get a backup. Sorry, people are walking by the door and making things at me. This is bad for my attention deficit. But the bottom line is that we actually had this earlier this week, and I'll give you an example. Different framework than the person I was working with had ever seen before, and accidentally clicked the delete all users button, because there's a delete all users button that doesn't have a confirmation on it. Because thanks, Google. Apparently they don't click things that they don't know exactly what it does. But the bottom line is, what I did is I pulled the database backup that was going every hour. I think 2 people lost their registrations because they had registered in that last hour. I restored the database. I removed that effing button from that page and disabled the API that does that. And, and then I moved on. But these things happen, especially if you're dealing with code that you're only tangentially familiar with. The bottom line is back up your servers. I mean, personally, one of the tricks that I do is I just actually run an rsync on the boxes that I run challenges to another directory on the same box. I mean, that's one of the dumbest little tricks, but I just back it up to a directory and opt, and that way, if something is really truly gone because I fat-fingered a command or something, I've got that weak backup that's right there and ready to go, and it just stays up to date, and I don't have to think about it. But that's my strategy for that. Okay, repeatability. Obviously I've written a lot of these challenges, a lot of these contests over time. You find yourself doing the same things over and over. Let me say a couple of things about generating with Python. Anytime I do something which requires me to do calculations, crypto, XORs, ciphers, binary code, you name it, I'm always going to generate it with Python. Because, building things that have patterns that are difficult for reverse engineering tools to come up with the answer of like what the source code is, programmatically building ciphers, especially ones that have multiple steps or multiple rounds, it is so much easier to throw that in a for loop and then create the code that does that. So most of my reverse engineering challenges are generated with Python code that write out C or C++ code that I then compile. So don't be afraid of code that writes code. This is probably the beginning of how Skynet happens, but the bottom line is a lot of people have never even considered the fact that you can write code with other code. And it doesn't have to be complicated. You don't need all kinds of crazy backends. I just literally write print statements that generate well-formed C++ code, and then I write a script that compiles it automatically. And then, I have a variable in there that contains the flag, so that if I want to use the same challenge because it didn't get solved at Circle City Con, at next con I'm doing CTF, then I just change the flag, I rerun the thing, have some randomization in there, right? So you're not getting the same crypto constants, you're not getting the same things like that. Generate a new one, and you're ready to go. The bottom line is that challenges like this take effort to write, right? And so anything that you can do as the author of one of these to make it so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you want to write a new thing, this is your force multiplier. This is exactly how I'm able to do 10 to 15 CTFs a year, because I write it right the first time, and I can generate it as many times as I need to. Iterating from historic challenges. This is the second upshot of writing it in Python like that, is that now I'm like, somebody solved it or somebody didn't solve it. I can take that historic challenge, I can tweak the premise a little bit, and then I can use it as a new challenge. That's what I was talking about, building that toolbox. I have, probably 400 or 500 different generators that I can pull from, and you actually can take those, modify it, and create wholly new challenges by combining them and doing cool things. Keep your history, so that you can iterate and refine over time. And the last thing that I'll tell you about my strategy, save your server configs, especially if you are not a web admin or somebody that does that sort of stuff all the time. I can tell you how many times I have to Google exactly how to get the stupid UWSGI socket into the right place so that Nginx can write it. I mean, the funny thing is that my strategy on this one, there's two things. Well, I mean, there's the things that I save off when I say save server configs. What I will save off is all of the configuration files, like the confs for the technologies I'm using. I also save my bash history. Put your bash history into that same zip file wherever you do, because gosh darn it, I never ever code it back into the config. I always just fix it from the command line, because usually there's 30 minutes and the time is counting down to starting the thing, and I just need it to start, and if it crashes, I'll run the stupid command again, right? So, this is my, simple backup tip. If you're doing something like this, put your bash history in that repository before you ship it off and put it on the shelf after the end of action. And this is what I do. And at the end of every CTF, so sometime next week after I've, slept for a good 48 to 96 hours, I'm going to go onto the servers. I'm going to pull all the log files. I'm going to pull the database. I'm going to pull the conf files that got installed as part of Nginx and UWSGI and all of that. And then I'm going to pull my bash history from the command line, put it in a zip file, encrypt it, and throw it in my, my data pile for posterity. But that's my pro tip on this side. Okay, that was long and rambly, and I went through a lot of things, but that's pretty much it. That's, in a nutshell, my CTF methodology and philosophy. So I will open it up to any questions for anybody in the room. Yeah. So this one's my largest one a year. I think probably the fastest that I've put one together is probably the equivalent of about 16 to 24 hours of effort. That's where I was able to regenerate and use things that I had from the past. I generally write 15 to 20 new challenges for the Circle CTF. This is the largest one I do a year. I'm probably in the 80 to 100, well, no, it's more than that. Probably 120 to 160 hours at this point, give or take. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Sure. Yes. Yes. So this is I'll go back to the immersive story piece. So, especially so I've done training CTFs before. What you do is just like when you're doing a curriculum, from that compliance and training perspective, you've got the individual objectives. You know, for example, maybe like email security, link security, you know, whatever those things are. I will actually start with those objectives and then work backwards to the challenges from there. So basically, you know, you come up with here's what do we learn on the show today, Craig? You start there and then you go backwards where you find the technologies that are involved there. And, you know, for a phishing one, for example, I did where I generated phishing emails and legitimate emails, from a server where they could pull the API and they had to respond, for example, with, is this a phish or not? Programmatically to do it 10 times in a row. And I'm talking about, like, this was obvious stuff like china.ru is the URL of the PayPal link in the email, right? And so things like that are practical training things. Build it into an example that's whimsical yet instructional, and try to create a challenge out of that so that people get familiar to seeing the patterns that they need to pick up in the real world. And that pattern management, I'll give another example about that. So, like, if we see a string in my CTF that's got 2 equal signs at the end of it, what are we going to do? We're going to base 64 to code that. Why do I know that? Well, I didn't know that until I saw that a bunch of times, and I didn't know what to do, and somebody's like, oh, that's got 2 equal signs, base 64 the crap out of that, right? That same pattern is what I always try to shoot for when I'm training people, so that that instinct kicks in that says, wait a minute, this is an email from PayPal. I haven't done anything with PayPal. Let me look at the link before I click it. Things that can induce that pattern learning is the best way to teach people in my example. But thank you for the question. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah, it's called Crap Your Pants About 4 hours before and you're dropping a bunch of challenges that you haven't tried out yet. No, I'm kidding. But the bottom line is that I have subject matter experts that I know from times past. So if I know somebody that's really good at web challenges or somebody that's really good at crypto challenges, yada, 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 what I do is I buy them booze, and I make sure they're not coming to the conference that I do it, and then I reach out to them and help them. The reason that I try to get subject matter experts to look at it is that it's more expedient, because I don't want to waste their time. And a lot of times I will instruct them all the way up to what I would consider the twist or the deviation, right? So I set the scene for them so to make sure that my signpost is realistic, so that I don't waste their time with the discovery parts. I'll say, here's a binary. There's a function in it that's got a weird pattern that breaks IDA. Reverse engineer this really quick for me. What do you think it's doing? Sometimes I don't even ask them to solve it all the way, right? Because sometimes there's tedious parts. I'll just say, what do you think this is doing? And give me your intuition, because if their intuition matches up with what I intended the signpost to be, that's a pretty good indication to me that it's up on the up and up. And I'll tell you this, if I don't have a playtester, I didn't mention this, if I don't have a playtester, like especially for the netcat challenges and the stuff that I'm doing on the fly, I actually write a script that solves the problem myself. So for all the stuff I do that's server-based, I've got scripting that's part of my repo in my source code, source code management tool that can solve it if I point it to the server. So that's the other way that I do it, to prove that it, can be done. Good question. All right, I probably got time for a couple more. If there are any other questions, else I'm going to go take some muscle relaxants. Awesome. Well, thank you all for giving me the time. I hope you learned something, and hope you enjoy the rest of the con.